Vladimir Putin urgently appealed to Donald Trump for help in ending the war against Ukraine. At least that's the statement Donald Trump made the day before. He said Putin called him personally, admitting he couldn't resolve the Ukraine war for over 10 years and asked for help. Sounds crazy, right? But don't jump to conclusions. What was Putin himself doing at that time? He was convening the Security Council of the Russian Federation and called on the Ministry of Defense to prepare for nuclear tests. And this news can actually be encouraging. Let me explain why. Donald Trump spent nearly a year seeking ways to approach Putin and persuade him to negotiate, or to weaken him so much that Russia would be forced to agree to end the war. But Trump was betting on personal ties with Putin, which turned out to be a losing move. And now Trump has found Putin's weak spot. On one hand, Trump is imposing sanctions against Russia's oil giants, which has already led to a 30% drop in revenues in October. And on the other hand, Trump is dragging Putin into an arms race, which will be very costly for the Russian budget. But the Russian army will never be able to become stronger than the American one anyway. And therefore, in this light, Trump's statement that Putin asked him for help 2 weeks ago doesn't sound so crazy anymore. My name is Alexei Peachy. Let's discuss this topic in detail, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, write any long comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video, where we post breaking news as it comes in. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so through donations or a paid sponsorship subscription. Use the links and payment details provided. The video description says Momenitis, support the Alexei Peachy channel. Choose any option that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you give. So, United States President Donald Trump stated that the Russian leader Vladimir Putin allegedly asked him to help resolve the war in Ukraine during their last phone conversation. During his speech at the American Business Forum in Miami, Trump stated, and I quote, "They tried to resolve this war for 10 years and couldn't do it. You have to resolve it." That is, Trump claims that Putin admitted he hasn't been able to get out of this war for more than 10 years. But, as they say, you shouldn't have any illusions, because Putin still wants to end the war on his own terms. Trump added that he resolved some of these issues in an hour, but he didn't specify exactly what agreements he was talking about. At the same time, Trump criticized the United Nations, accusing it of complete inaction in resolving the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts. According to him, he will stop them after returning to the White House in January 2025. Well, those notorious 8 wars. And here's a bit of background. Trump and Putin last spoke by phone on October 16th. The Kremlin claims that during this conversation, Putin warned the American president against supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk missiles, because it would harm relations between Russia and the United States. After the call, Trump stated that now is not the best time to introduce new sanctions against Russia, since it could spoil relations with the Russian president. But a few days later, everything changed. Trump called off the Budapest meeting with Putin, but still imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. And that really became a turning point. Let me remind you that once Donald Trump claimed he would end the war in 24 hours, and it seems he really believed it. After all, the basis of Donald Trump's diplomacy was, first and foremost, establishing personal contact with Vladimir Putin, and someone had to help Donald Trump with that. And one of the key figures in this new approach turned out to be a close friend of Trump, his special representative in the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. He met Vladimir Putin several times. After each of these visits, both the White House and the Kremlin stated that the sides had come closer to mutual understanding. And after that, Trump would backtrack. As we already know, in the end, this strategy of personal contacts completely failed. The parties were never able to make progress toward agreements to stop the war or even achieve a ceasefire. Witkoff was too confident and assured Trump that Putin was ready to make concessions on Ukraine for the sake of trade deals. This was especially clear at the Anchorage summit. Back then in August, Trump offered Vladimir Putin sanctions relief and economic cooperation in exchange for a ceasefire. This deal seemed beneficial for the Kremlin to the White House. But the Russian president refused, demanding Ukraine surrender and transfer the remaining Donbas territories to Russia. He also gave Trump a history lecture, which made him very angry. By the way, later the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, reminded Trump that Ukrainians had long warned him that Putin was trying to sell him, quote, low-quality goods. Speaking of which, personal diplomacy failed miserably, and Trump said that Vitkov doesn't understand anything about politics at all. But the whole problem is that for a long time, Trump couldn't understand one thing: Putin doesn't need territories. In July 2024, that is, even before Trump's presidency, at a meeting of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Putin for the first time announced his full list of demands to end the war against Ukraine. Since then, I want to stress, he hasn't changed his rhetoric. Among them are the recognition of Russian sovereignty over 5 Ukrainian regions within their administrative borders, Ukraine's neutral status, reduction of the Ukrainian army, securing the status of the Russian language, and lifting the sanctions imposed by the West against Russia. All of them. Moscow agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine only after reaching a major political agreement. In this, the Kremlin's position contradicts what the United States and Ukraine are seeking, namely an immediate ceasefire that should launch major negotiations. After the summit in Alaska, Trump briefly abandoned this idea, but now he is once again demanding to stop the fighting along the line of contact. And I think that over time, the Kremlin will realize how badly they messed up with Trump. Maybe many people have already forgotten, but in April of this year, Trump said that Crimea would remain Russian, and Trump was ready to recognize it as Russian, even at the level of the United States. And also Trump said in the summer that Ukraine should give up part of the south of our country. And this idea was then spread on television broadcasts. All the White House officials still remember that notorious territorial exchange. But Putin refused this and brought everything to the point where now Trump says that Ukraine and Russia just need to fight it out and watch what happens next. And in this context, it's quite realistic that Putin asked Trump to help him end the war. After all, there is no territoriality. The real questions about the political and military future of Ukraine after the end of the war, that's what matters to Putin. And on these topics, we're talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, arms supplies, and the political structure of the country after the end of the war. And so far, Washington hasn't been able to reach an understanding with Moscow, and Putin might ask Trump to push Ukraine toward actual capitulation, but it's already too late for the Kremlin on this issue. And basically, the past few weeks have shown that Ukraine has managed to reset its relationship with Trump. The task for Kyiv and its European allies is to convince Washington that the capitulation Putin is essentially seeking would cause irreparable damage to European security and, as a result, to American interests. And now the most astonishing thing, Vladimir Putin's persistence has led to a situation where there are now 2 key politicians in the White House dealing with the Ukraine issue: Secretary of State Marco Rubio and, who would have thought, United States Vice President James David Vance. Meanwhile, European diplomats admit they expected Trump would eventually realize doing business with Putin is impossible. And so they were simply trying to buy time for Ukraine, and fortunately at this stage it worked. Later, Trump shifts tactics and promises to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Let me make a brief digression here. Russia is only brave enough to fight countries that are clearly much weaker. Let's take examples from recent decades: Moldova, Chechnya, Georgia, Abkhazia, and Syria. All these countries were clearly weaker than Russia, and that's why Russia attacked them so boldly. But as soon as there is at least parity, Russia immediately falls apart. Russia got bogged down in the war against Ukraine because the opponent was stronger. However, as you know, there is still no parity. Even now, Russia can't win. And now Trump directly states, I'll give Ukraine Tomahawks, you'll be more or less on the same level. And then we'll see how bravely Putin will wage war against an opponent who has gained the ability to strike Moscow with missiles, just as Moscow can strike Kyiv with missiles. The idea was to pressure Putin for concessions, or else Ukraine would get Tomahawks. Putin started rushing around and urgently asked to speak with Trump. And after the conversation on October 16 between Putin and Trump, it seemed that Russia even managed to smooth things over a bit. The decision about the Tomahawks was postponed. But after news broke that the Budapest summit collapsed, Trump lost patience. For the first time in 9 months of his presidency, the United States hit Russia with sanctions. They were imposed against the largest Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And this is where a new chapter begins. Today, the Russian Ministry of Finance announced that Russian budget oil and gas revenues fell nearly 30% in October. And let me remind you, the sanctions haven't even come into full effect yet. But Trump decided to use a long-proven effective tactic. In addition to the sanctions that are already strangling the Russian economy, Trump forced Putin into an arms race that will cost Russia a huge amount of money. Just a week after imposing sanctions, Trump announces that the United States will resume nuclear testing. And already on November 5, the United States conducts the third test launch of the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile. And Putin fell for this trick. On November 5, he calls a Russian Security Council meeting and urges the Defense Ministry to prepare nuclear tests on Novaya Zemlya. But the paradox is that the United States can afford to rattle its nuclear weapons with an economy that is doing much better than Russia's. But Putin, no matter how hard he tries, could simply end his arms race, and that's even under sanctions. Just like the Soviet Union once ended it. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.